Hello, and welcome to FTT Chats, where we sit down with some of the great and the good of FinTech for a bit of a chat. So today I'm speaking to Simon Crown of Clifford Chance. Hello, Simon. How are you?
Yeah, good morning, Liz. I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, it's sunny. It's a good day out. So yeah, I'm in a happy mood. So I'm going to ask my first question, and it's a question that I ask everybody so that you can introduce yourself to everyone in the community. Who are you and what do you do?
Okay, so Simon Crown. I'm a partner at Clifford Chance. I've been there over 21 years. I have been in the regulatory team there, so financial regulatory advisory team, all of that time. And what I cover is financial services advisory. So basically anything to do with FCA, PRA, PSR, and basically we cover all full range of financial services in my team, apart from insurance, which is dealt with in a slightly different team. So I have a focus on asset managers. I do financial M&A, the regulatory bits. And I also head up our FinTech and our payments practices as well with two other partners. So a lot of payments work. So right back from PSD1, PSD2. We also did a lot of work for the European Payments Council, and hopefully later on we'll talk a little bit about what else we do in other countries as well in that space.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned FinTech. I mean, most people outside of our world know Clifford Chance is a Magic Circle law firm. You know, how do you fit into that wider FinTech ecosystem?
Yeah. So our approach here is to try and have a range of different client types in this space. So obviously if you'd looked back 10 years ago, our client base would have been in the financial services space would have been largely bank focused, and then that grew in respect of asset managers. So this would be people like the high street banks, the commercial banks, the investment banks, some of them with their own asset management divisions, some standalone asset managers, and then in the payment space we would have some infrastructure providers, so maybe a large card scheme, and then that sort of 20 years ago, we spent a lot of time doing the .com work. So how did those businesses start putting their services online, and in particular, what hurdles were faced when they were trying to provide those services into different jurisdictions? So were there local obstacles to online provision? And obviously, through all of this is a lot of work on data. As well. Now, in respect to FinTech, we have done lots and lots of work with those sorts of established financial service providers, but then also cutting edge FinTech providers as well. Obviously, as a law firm, we have restrictions on what we can say about who we act for and what we're doing for them. But the point is that we have a full range. So from small innovators to the sort of the innovatory divisions within the large banking groups as well.
So that kind of, as you mentioned before, that sort of deep, financial services knowledge and all of the, regulatory aspects, that's incredibly valuable to some of the new entrants in this space, that sort of depth of knowledge that you guys bring.
Yeah, that's right. And that's normally one of the first touch points, with a developing financial service business is well, first question is always characterization. So how does what new clients are proposing to do, how does it fit into the existing legal regime? And also, which legal regimes are we talking about? Because if there's one sort of common weak spot in some digital businesses is forgetting about cross-border client acquisition and the fact that those clients have to be acquired legally, and what the different rule sets might be for example, if you have a client who is in a different jurisdiction. So we always focus on that quite a lot. So first one is characterization, and obviously if we're looking at anything in the crypto space, then that is obviously a highly dynamic issue, or has been over the past few years. So yeah, so characterization, how you market it. Do you need a license to do it? How do you set your business up? The other thing that comes up a lot, obviously, is IP ownership. For example, if you have an idea and it's a couple of friends and someone with some money, and that whole point about who owns and controls the IP in this growing business is obviously crucial. And what you don't want to find is that there are weaknesses in that at the time you come to your second round of funding, or you come to try and sell yourself, because obviously that's one thing that the lawyers will test, is how is the IP owned.
Yeah. So I wanted to move on to talk a little bit about open banking and open finance. So, we're having this chat after our virtual spring event that you were one of the main speakers for last week. So you were on the open finance panel. Yeah. And all of these conversations that the industry's been having over the years is this notion of consent, of opting in to share your data, to get access to certain apps and platforms. But there was a conversation that happened where there's sort of this discussion around consent, but also the right to revoke consent. So from a legal point of view, what's kind of the harder conversation to have, that consent conversation, or the practicalities around the revoking conversation? Yeah,
well, I mean, I think there are challenges around both. And if you just looking at the FCA paper, I mean, the FCA picks this out. So even the well recognized concept of having to get consent from a data subject before you can do something with that data is itself sort of challenged by various issues. So, for example, how often does consent need to be obtained? So does consent need to be refreshed? And we can see that that there are different approaches to that under the payment service regulations than there are under the broader GDPR framework. So, of course, one of the issues is consent given and then forgotten about. And meanwhile, the business that's obtained that consent can then merrily go off and use that. So does that need to be sort of re-authenticated regularly? And I suspect that the FCA will want to do that as they expand beyond open banking and into open finance. They will probably want refreshed consent, but it always has to be balanced with this fundamental problem of lack of consumer engagement. The danger in the fintech space is that people who work in that space tend to be engaged with innovative financial services. They have an interest in it, and they probably do, they probably have a look at product features as they come out, and they probably turn to the consumer finance page.
Take all my data.
Yeah, exactly. So they take an interest in that. But I suspect that is probably quite a small minority, and the feature of the rest of the market is probably inertia or lack of understanding. And so that points to the importance of informed consent for a start, and then re-authentication. Now, the question of, as you say, sort of right to revoke. Now that's obviously got some quite a lot of publicity more generally as a concept in respect of the right to be forgotten. So if we think about the Google case and so on, but I suspect that it's again largely exercised by that small minority. Now, obviously, from a technical perspective, withdrawal of consent is probably technically more challenging than simply obtaining consent. And I think the key issue here is going to be within what timescale does the firm need to act on that, and are there has that data gone on to other parties? Does it need to be retracted from them? How does that work? And what are the rights of redress when this all goes wrong? Now, I think the FCA is shaping up for a tougher consent, refresh, re-authentication, and right to revoke regime than is currently found under the GDPR. That's what I can see, because I think they would see the GDPR as probably being too generous to the users of the data in that respect. So the PSRs are obviously tougher on this in respect of TPPs, and I think as it's opened up to open finance, I think it will be tougher again.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, these are of course ongoing discussions, and that kind of leads me into my next question. I mean, you mentioned the FCA, has a consultation on open finance going on. The European Commission has a consultation, which is due, I guess, the end of June. What are some of the lessons from open banking that the industry is grappling with to learn and move forward to have a more successful, open finance push?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we talked in the event about the problems with API development, and I think if you were asking that same question of the team at the FCA responsible for open banking, they'd probably quietly be frustrated with the development of APIs in some respects. And I don't think they'd probably say that was deliberate on the part of the banks, but I think they would say that the banks are clearly facing some of the banks are facing some technological challenges in respect of API development, and obviously that's in respect of sort of a single product, which is a bank current account. That if you apply the API problem to say different products, an insurance account or pensions, as we're already seeing, it can become much more complicated. So I think there's the API development point. I think the problem that we've just talked about, which is of lack of public engagement, lack of consumer engagement, remains an issue. And yet, looking at the past 3 months, you can see that actually you can have confidence in the right circumstances and with the right information that you can get large numbers of people to do things differently. Okay. And also to do things differently technologically. So if we think about just the ways of schooling, for example, so about how schooling, in obviously different respects for different schools, but has largely shifted online. So there's no reason why advances couldn't be made in respect of engagement with online financial services. I mean, what's interesting is the FCA has got this very good table about what it expected to develop in respect of open banking services, and what it didn't expect and which has developed. And also when it's looking at open finance, it's already sort of pointing towards the sorts of things that might be capable of being developed. I think a really interesting one is this sort of holistic financial management platform, where you would have a view of all of your financial data, and you would be hopefully receiving advice and maybe taking advantage of that advice. So for example, with sweeping arrangements, let's just say you were lucky enough to have some surplus cash, that is swept to the best source, given what you've told the platform in respect of how quickly you want it back and how much risk you will take. But let's just say you tolerated any bank which had a deposit guarantee protection, and you didn't want to lock it up for more than a week. Well, there are some parameters, and that sweeping could then go and take place. So I think the opportunities are there. I think what the FCA is also looking at is a killer app or two or three would really generate interest here among outside of that sort of core group. I think there's a demographic element here as well. So my guess is that engagement per generation is really quite different. So if we looked at the numbers of people in their say early 20s who would look beyond the high street banks for their current account provision, my guess is that is significantly greater than other age ranges. And so that is probably, this is not of course an eye-opening point, it's probably well known, but that is probably where the innovation will take off as open finance develops.
But I'm glad you mentioned earlier that sort of, from a consumer point of view, that holistic financial platform. In my mind, that's like the holy grail of fintech, kind of what so many in the industry have kind of been working towards creating for a number of years. Yeah. If that's made possible, that's a complete game changer for the industry.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, so there's some interesting points in the FCA's paper on this, because again, this whole topic is about balancing conflicting requirements. Because so if we take, for example, that sweeping that we've just talked about, and so if you think about from a money making perspective, from the purpose of the consumer, so I've got surplus money and I want to get the best return over the next year on those savings. Well, you could have a sweeping, an automatic sweeping arrangement, which can then be forgotten about, because you know that on a daily basis that rates are being checked and money's being swept to the best accounts. But what the FCA points out is, well, what about the potential that creates for lack of engagement? In other words, you've sort of fired and forgotten, but what about do you then come back to that product? Should you be required to come back to it? So in other words, does the provider have to come back and say, we've been providing this service to you for 12 weeks, please reauthorize us to do it? Which is a concept that we already have in respect of TPPs. But I think so there's that balance between sort of efficiency of sweeping and continued engagement is a difficult one to strike.
Yeah. No, as I said before, interesting conversations are afoot. So I look forward. I'm always very hopeful with the open finance world. Hopefully someday, knock on wood. So, I mean, my final question is this, and I'm going off piste because I do think that we do not live on fintech alone. So I wanted to delve in a little bit more of a personal question. What brings you joy, Simon?
What brings me joy? Well, so you're asking that of someone who's sat in their glorified shed at the bottom of the garden, has been here for what it is, 3 months now, like most people, I suppose. So, I mean, the thing that's been, I've been doing a lot of writing recently, and it's legal writing. So I've been writing a chapter for a legal textbook, and the pace of that has actually been quite enjoyable, because our normal day-to-day legal practice is, a lot of conference calls and emails, and can you do this now? Can you do this? It's all quite frantic. Whereas sort of getting back to the books and the cross-referencing and editing my writing much more carefully and so on has been a good change of pace. And the other thing I've been doing at the moment, which some of the viewers might find quite surprising that a law firm does this, but we one of our lines of business is we help jurisdictions develop legislation. So in other words, create a legal and regulatory framework for a new area. And so, for example, I can't unfortunately name these jurisdictions, but some of them are relatively well known. So if you think about sort of new developing financial centers, maybe in the Middle East, maybe in some Asian jurisdictions, they don't start from scratch with generally speaking, and sort of think, well, how are we going to do this? They obviously look around and they look to see, well, what works well in that jurisdiction and that jurisdiction. And so one thing that we've done for many years is we have been consultants to those governments when they've been looking to do that. And over the past few years, some of that has been in the fintech space. So at the moment, I'm working on a new fintech law for an Asian jurisdiction, and so we've just drafted the policy paper, and then when that is approved, we will be drafting the primary legislation for it. We've also been working on an equity crowdfunding law for an African jurisdiction, and we will do things like, what's the rule book that a particular jurisdiction needs in respect of, say, digital banking. And so we will obviously we'll be benchmarking with our colleagues and our partners and other firms, what's the position in, say, Singapore? What's the DIFC in Dubai? What have they done about it? What are the Canadians doing about it? The Australians, for example, what are the taking sort of best practice, and then trying to connect it to the legal system that's already there. And what this gives is a sort of tried and tested regime with some new features, and that is appealing to existing financial institutions that normally the governments are seeking to attract. So if they want the big players to come and say, oh, actually we could use that as our hub for, say, development of financing services in that jurisdiction. So this has been quite a big sort of line of work for us in the fintech space recently, and it's obviously been a good way to look at detail in how fintech law has been developing in different jurisdictions. We've literally had to put them side by side, pick out the good bits, the bad bits, how they could work if you put them together.
Cool. So roaming the globe, bringing effective, advice on fintech regulation to various jurisdictions brings me joy. You picked the right job, Simon. Excellent. Cool. So thank you very much. I appreciate you sitting down for a chat with us. And as always, stay safe.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks.